Hey everybody, this is Paul. In my garage, it's midnight. Seems like a good time to shoot to shoot a totally unprepared, off-the-cuff video. Shop looks like shit. Stuff scattered all over the place. I'm not even wearing pants. No, that's not true. I am wearing pants, but I'm not wearing shoes. So, for those of you who may have been paying attention before, meaning those of you who have nothing better to do with your time, I managed to put this turd on its side about a week ago. As you can see from the band-aids that Chris put on the side for me. I think the idea is that I'm supposed to wear those like a badge of honor, like the guy who starts boxing, gets his first black eye, runs out to see all of his friends before the black eye goes away. Check it out, bro, black eye. We're banging hard. I think that's what those are supposed to be for. But back to the point. It seemed like a good idea to avoid tipping this over again since my knee is still fucked up, my elbow's still fucked up, my hip is still fucked up, the cage is still bent, and the seat bracket is still broken. So we considered training wheels, but realized it wouldn't fit in the trailer. So there's two choices. I can either learn to drive, or we could make this thing less tippy. And to be more serious about it all, the suspension on these things really is awful. They're very, very tippy, and they like to do endos when you jump them as well. It's almost as if Can-Am decided to test Darwin and put this thing out on the market and see how many people would just completely fuck themselves up with it. And it took me 6 years, but I finally did. But let me get to the point. So to fix the suspension on this, the first thing we have to do is find out what it is. My buddy Jason Trumpio came over last weekend, I think, and we decided to gather some data for this vehicle to use to redo the suspension. And let me see, what did we gather? Sprung and unsprung masses, weight distribution front to rear, factory spring rates, anti-roll bar rates. We tested the dampers. Let's see, what else did we test? I don't remember what else we got. Oh, the last thing is tire spring rate. You can rough that out with a dial indicator on the wheel by adding some weight to the bumper and that sort of thing. We decided to build a fixture to do that so we can test the tire spring rate across a wide range of pressures, because that tire spring is an important part of the overall system. But to the point. Typically, when we look at suspension systems, we're thinking about things in the frequency domain, meaning that we have masses and we have springs and we have dampers, and that describes some very simple known models of oscillating systems. Anyone who's been to school for mechanical engineering, I believe by the point probably in their third year, gets to a vibrations class where we talk about how these things work. And we tend to look at the response of the vehicle in terms of its oscillation, its overshoot or lack of overshoot versus frequency. And there's good reason for doing that. Everything's been very well worked out over time. It's a very sensible approach, but it assumes periodic motion. And one of the things that we have to consider for a vehicle like this is a more discrete event, much like I've been doing with drag race vehicles lately. For instance, the launch is a very discrete event. You essentially bang the weight back onto the rear tires. There is no periodic motion at that point, and there are some important things to be gleaned by considering specific events outside of the frequency domain. And so, as I'm trying to decide what to do to this damn thing, I found a really cool video well, I don't remember where I found it. It doesn't matter. They were talking about WRC rally cars, which are the absolute pinnacle of off-road suspension stuff. I mean, the trophy trucks are cool, but in terms of technology, they really pale in comparison to the FIA WRC cars, mostly because of the amount of money that's being spent. And they had a video where they had a car suspended about 9 feet in the air, and they made mention that these cars will often jump as high as 3 feet in the air. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to see what it would take to be able to jump this thing I said 3 feet. I meant 3 meters, which is a little over 9 feet in the air. And I became curious, what would it take to catch this thing from 9 feet in the air, 3 meters in the air. So I'm going to wander away from this silly vehicle into my office, where I did do a little bit of preparation for this. I had to scribble down some basic mathematics, and we're gonna consider a discrete event, which is, you know, the thing falling from 9 feet in the air, as opposed to considering the suspension in the frequency domain. And look at this, I even set up a tripod. So I scribbled all this stuff down on the board night before last. Whoops, hang on, turn on the music or noise, depending on your point of view. Scribbled this stuff down. Hopefully, let's see here. Hopefully everybody can read all of that. Let me adjust it. Okay, so I promised that these were going to be as off the cuff as possible, as a way for me to practice passing on technical information with little to no preparation ahead of time. And so because I laid this all out ahead of time on the board, I gave it a day, and here I am walking into my office cold, looking at the board, wondering what the fuck I'm going to say to you now. So to start with, it's a 2011 Can-Am Commander. It weighs 800 kilograms, about 53% of the weight is on the rear tires. And the suspension travel is 0.3 of a meter, which is about 11 inches. And so to use these numbers to decide whether or not I can drop this from 9 feet in the air and catch it appropriately rather than destroying it, I decided to just pick a corner of the vehicle. And so we're going to model the corner. It doesn't matter whether it's a right front corner or a left front corner. We're going to consider that the vehicle lands on all 4 tires at the same time, and try to decide, given the spring choices and damper availability, if it's even possible. And in fact, now that I think about it, as I worked through the numbers the other night, I forgot. I almost immediately realized that 3 meters was absolute insanity. One, because I don't want to be in the damn thing when it's that high in the air, but the other is that the damper forces got really out of control. It was potentially doable in terms of the dampers themselves, but there's a pretty good chance it would just break the brackets right off the frame. So I'll make that correction. Now we're going to drop it from 1 meter. And I want to talk about some of the forces involved, the energy that needs to be absorbed, either stored as potential energy and dissipated, or well, just dealt with in general. So, right front corner, the sprung mass is 158 kilograms, and the spring rate at the wheel, which means the motion ratio has already been taken into account, is 5,680 newtons per meter. So those are the basic parameters that we have for that right front corner of the vehicle. And so the very first thing we need to do is decide how much energy is there when we drop it from 1 meter. Obviously, if I drop anything, a football, a can of beans, from 1 meter or 2 meters or 3 meters, as the height increases, the amount of energy that you have to deal with when that thing hits the ground is considerably greater as the height goes up. And in this case, what we're talking about is kinetic energy. And kinetic energy is the energy that exists in any object that has mass that's in motion. So if I throw a baseball at you and knock you on the head, the pain you feel is the pain from the kinetic energy that you absorbed with your head. So think about it that way. So the basic formula, which you can look up anywhere, for the total kinetic energy is 1/2 mass times velocity squared, which in this case ends up being 1,550 joules. So that tells us the energy that we have to deal with. And then I also calculated the velocity, because that gives us a good starting point for damper velocity when the vehicle hits the ground. So the calculation for velocity is a square root of 2 times the acceleration of gravity times the distance, which is of course 1 meter. And we end up with 4.43 meters per second, which is hauling ass. That's a pretty high velocity. So back to the vehicle. The very first thing we want to look at is how much of the energy are we going to absorb with the spring. And probably the first thing I should say is that absorb is the wrong word. What we're going to do is store the energy in the spring, because that's how a spring works. So if we compress the spring all the way across its range of 0.3 of a meter, we find that spring will store 383 joules of potential energy, and the formula that we use to arrive at that is 1/2 of the spring rate times the distance squared, distance displacement, whatever you want to call it. In any case, D works. So if we compress that spring all the way, we've taken 383 joules and stored it in that spring. Now that spring can then release that later to be dissipated by the damper and the rebound stroke, or if we had no rebound damping, to just heave the vehicle back up in the air. But in any case, we've got a damper and a spring to deal with this energy, and that's the amount that the spring is going to deal with for us, or at least store. So the remaining energy out of our 1550 joules minus 383 is, what do we have here? Well, that's fucked up. Oh, I see, 1170 joules. That's a J. I can't even read my own fucking writing. I thought it was 11705. 1170 joules is what we have left to deal with the damper. And so the difference between the damper and the spring is that the damper is going to dissipate energy, whereas the spring just stores it. And in this case, it's going to take that kinetic energy and it's going to convert it to heat energy. And it's an important point to make while I'm on this subject, that the dampers on your car and the brakes on your car perform exactly the same function, and that is that they convert kinetic energy to heat. So if you're driving down the road and you stomp on your brakes, the vehicle represents a certain amount of kinetic energy based on the mass and the speed that it's traveling, which you can see in the formula over there to the left, which is outlined in black. And the brakes then, through friction, turn that energy into heat until you come to a stop. Same thing happens with the dampers, whether it's the kinetic energy of the suspension or of the whole vehicle dropping from the sky, or the kinetic energy of the sprung mass moving. The point is that we're going to use that damper to take that energy and turn it into heat. Otherwise, the vehicle would just oscillate up and down forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, which would be a bad thing. So the very first thing we want to look at is, what is the average damper force required to dissipate that remaining energy? And that's what you see in the first line down there in green, and that is the remaining kinetic energy divided by the distance that we have to dissipate that energy. And what we find is that we need to have an average damping force of 3,890 newtons over that distance to dissipate that much energy. And so we're going to make a really big assumption here, and you'll find that quite often when you're doing any physics-based calculations or any engineering calculations, there are always assumptions, meaning you're almost never going to come up with an exact answer, because it's a model, it's a prediction, it's an extrapolation. And in this case, the assumption that we're going to make is that when the vehicle hits the ground, the damper is immediately going to accelerate to the velocity of the vehicle as it's flying through the air, and then it's going to taper down linearly from there to bringing it to a dead stop right at the point that we run out of suspension travel. And so for any of you paying attention and at all familiar with physics, you're thinking, I'm sure, that that's a pretty big assumption, and it really is. However, if we plot this out the correct way, doing a time step in Microsoft Excel, or if we model it in MATLAB, or even if we do a basic differential equation, we'll find that that's not too far off to arrive at that answer. In any case, from there, we can convert that to a damping constant. And the way we do that is we take the, what do we got here? 2 times displacement over velocity. Yeah, okay, so we look at damping force, essentially damping force over velocity. We double it in this case because it's the average that we're ultimately interested in, and we end up with a damping constant of 1760 Newton seconds per meter. And what that means to those of you who are interested in dampers, and I hope that's why you're here, because this is part of this this series about the new shock dyno, or new damper dyno, is that looking at the force velocity curve below, which you might describe as a linear curve, we describe the damping coefficient as the slope of the line. And in this case, we're looking at compression damping, because the damper will be moving in compression when the vehicle hits the ground. And it's essentially rise over run. Now, another way to look at it is simply the damping force at any velocity divided by the velocity. So if we had a damping force of, let's say, 1760 at 10 meters per second, then our constant would be 1760 divided by 10. It's literally quite that simple. And here's where the confusion might come from. You might not have considered thinking of damping in those terms, because typical damping terminology outside of the world of physics, meaning, you know, guys who have shock dynos and play with shocks all the time, tend to be described as progressive or digressive or linear. And in fact, all dampers are linear, or at least mostly so, once they pass the knee, once we get into the range where the shim stack is open. And a more appropriate way to look at this would be in terms of offset of that line. So we have a given slope, which determines our damping constant, and we can look at where that line crosses zero. If this were a what we call a digressive profile, which is a silly term, I wish it would go away, but it won't. We would find that if we do a straight line approximation through the linear portion of the curve, that it will pass through zero velocity at some positive value. And so what people call a digressive damping curve, I simply call a damper with a positive intercept. On the other hand, if we put an absolute shitload of bleed in this thing, where the curve was very, what people would call progressive at first, as the initial portion of the curve follows the typical exponential shape, then we would call that a progressive curve, but in fact, we would find that our straight line approximation passes through zero velocity at a force value that is negative. So I would describe a damper like that as having a negative intercept rather than a positive intercept. But for the sake of basic calculations, it's always easiest to assume that the damper is what someone would describe as linear, or I would say improperly describe as linear, and essentially having an intercept of zero. So that's the simple step through to throw some numbers at a problem like this and determine how much damping you would need to even get the job done. Now, this says nothing about how much damping it takes to make the driver comfortable, or how much damping it takes, overall damping it takes to make the vehicle generate the best grip. Those things are better suited for the frequency-based analysis. But in this case, we're looking at a discrete event. Again, if this thing is 1 meter in the air, which is really not that high, considering the size of the vehicle, it probably feels like a pretty big jump, but it's certainly doable, although not the way the thing is now. They like to do endos when you jump them. And if you don't believe me, look up Can-Am Commander Flip or something similar on YouTube, and you'll get to see some cool videos of a vehicle that appears to be designed to kill people. But in any case, my point is that what we've just done doesn't tell us anything about the amount of damping that'll make the vehicle wonderful to drive. It simply says this amount of compression damping with the spring that we have chosen will allow the vehicle to drop from 3 feet and arrive at zero damper velocity at the same time that it runs out of travel. So I'm not sure how helpful this may be. It's hard for me to know who's watching this, how savvy they are, you know, whether or not this is the kind of calculation they can do on a napkin in a bar after a dozen beers, or if this is something that you might find just plain confusing because, oh my God, there's a little bit of math there. Whatever the case, hopefully you get something out of considering the vehicle and the dampers as in a discrete event rather than in the frequency domain. And if any of this is I don't want to say confusing, but if any of this is new to you, the reason that I scribbled this stuff down on the board is that they're very simple formulas. You can find them on the internet anywhere. You could probably find this on Wikipedia, although I have to caution you, that's probably not a good idea. They'll manage to fuck something up somehow. But this is pretty basic stuff, and the reason that I like to put this stuff out in this video, or the reason that we do seminars, PRI show, and things like that, is to let your average racer or, you know, your average car guy understand that physics are actually quite simple and quite easy to apply, and that the math involved is not complicated at all. And the reason this is so important to me is that I've maintained for years, most of my life, that math and physics should be taught better than they are, and the only reason that people don't like math is because their math teacher sucked. And I'll scream that till the day that I die. So look this over. Feel free to critique it. I did mention quite some time ago that the reason I do these videos off the cuff is that I'm trying to do a better job of offering technical explanations without a great deal of preparation. So in the same way that I'm here to learn and use you as my guinea pig, use the opportunity yourself. If you have a question for me, put it down in the comments. Send me a private message. Or if you're just someone who's paying attention, you realize that I just completely screwed the pooch here somewhere along the way, let me know so that I can repair it and I don't look like a moron for any longer than I have to. Like, don't wait 2 weeks and then tell me I fucked it up, right? Tell me right away so I can find it and correct it now. So, there it is, 21 minutes of Paul's Garage. Hope you like it. If you don't, well, tough shit. Internet's a big place. I'm sure you can find something interesting somewhere. Have a good night.